Welcome to your friendly neighborhood historian, where we discuss just enough history to inform, intrigue, and entertain. I'm Bill Petro. The history of Purim, the story of Esther. Purim, or Lots, is a Jewish holiday that celebrates the saving of the Jewish people from annihilation during the Achaemenid Empire, around 5 centuries before Christ, as recounted in the Old Testament book of Esther. This was during the reign of the Persian king Ahasuerus. It is currently celebrated as a Jewish feast day on the 14th and 15th days of the month of Adar. This year, Purim starts at sundown on March 13th. What was the Achaemenid Empire? Otherwise known as the First Persian Empire, it was founded by Cyrus the Great around 550 BC in what is now modern Iran. There had never been a larger empire before this time. It covered over 2 million square miles, from Egypt and the Balkans in the west to modern-day Pakistan and the Indus Valley in the southeast, and West Asia at its center and most of Central Asia in the northeast. Who was Cyrus? Cyrus of Persia had conquered the previous Median Empire, the Neo-Babylonian Empire, and Lydia, which is modern-day Turkey. His dynasty lasted until it was conquered by Alexander the Great. Here's a more familiar historical context. Following Alexander's death was the Hellenistic period. Hellenistic is Greek for Greek speakers and the Greek culture. Much of Alexander's former empire was controlled predominantly by 2 of his 4 remaining generals: the Seleucid Empire, headquartered in Antioch of Syria, and the Ptolemaic Kingdom, which was headquartered in Egypt. Cleopatra was the last of that dynasty. In the 1st century BC, much of Rome's Eastern Empire consisted of these lands. Who was Ahasuerus? Historians debate which of the 3 Persian rulers the name refers to in the book of Tobit, which is found in the Deuterocanonical Apocrypha. Many modern English translations render the old Persian name as Xerxes I, though others call the king Artaxerxes. There is even speculation that the king was Artaxerxes II. The story goes, on the 7th day of the great feast, during a banquet in his capital city of Susa, Ahasuerus was inebriated. He called his wife Vashti to dance and display her beauty before his guests, the nobles and governors of his provinces. The queen refused to appear. She was banned from the king's presence, and another was to be given her role as queen. This is where the story of Esther comes in. Ahasuerus decreed that all beautiful maidens should be brought before him at his palace at Susa, so that he may select a new queen. Meanwhile, Mordecai, a Jew of the tribe of Benjamin, was a captive taken from Judah by Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar. He had raised as his daughter a beautiful young cousin named Esther, who was an orphan. Her name in Greek would be Aster or Aster, which is translated star. Mordecai took her to the king's palace, where she resided in his harem. After 12 months in the harem beauty spa, her turn came up to be presented to the king. However, Mordecai cautioned her not to reveal that she was Jewish. As the Old Testament book of Esther relates, the king loved Esther more than all the women, and she won grace and favor in his sight more than all the virgins, so that he set the royal crown on her head and made her queen instead of Vashti. Esther became the queen of the Persian Empire around 480 BC, but there was a plot to kill the Jews. She was called Hadassah, or myrtle, because the righteous are compared to myrtle. As the myrtle spreads fragrance in the world, so did she spread good works. Then Mordecai, while sitting at the king's gate, learned of a plot to kill the king. He passed this intelligence to Esther, who's now queen, who warned the king, and the conspirators were executed. But the king's vain and arrogant vizier, the high official named Haman, was furious that Mordecai would not bow down to him at the gate as others did. When he learned that Mordecai was a Jew, he planned to destroy all the Jews throughout the Persian Empire. Haman cast lots, that's the meaning of the word Purim, to determine an auspicious day to speak to the king about this perceived danger. He told the king that the Jews did not keep the king's laws, suggesting that they were different from all other peoples in the kingdom and that they should be destroyed. The king commanded that the proclamation go out to kill the Jews. Mordecai, upon learning of this decree, clothed himself in sackcloth and ashes in mourning. He told Esther the news, and she requested that all Jews fast for 3 days before she was to speak to the king. Taking a risk to visit the king without being called by him, Esther put on her royal robes and stood in the king's inner court, where he could see her from his throne. Winning his favor, he invited her in. She asked that she be allowed to prepare a feast the next day for just the king and Haman. The king allowed it, and Haman went home rejoicing to his wife that he had such favor from the king and his queen Esther. He also planned to have Mordecai hanged on a newly built gallows. But the king was unable to sleep, and during his insomnia, he had read to him the Book of Memorable Deeds. In it, he learned that Mordecai had exposed the plot against the king's life. Realizing that this deed had never been honored, he asked his advisor Haman what should be done to honor someone who has delighted the king. Haman, thinking that the king was referring to himself, suggested the honoree be given royal robes, a horse, and a crown, and then paraded through the city square. And so it was done. For Mordecai, Haman was called to the feast with Queen Esther. On the second day of the feast, the king offered Esther the granting of a wish. She informed him that someone was plotting to kill her and all her people. When the king asked who it was, she replied, "A foe and enemy, the wicked Haman." Angrily, the king rose from the feast that Esther had prepared. Haman fell on Esther's couch to beg for his life. The king, suspecting an assault on the queen in his presence, arrested Haman. Ironically, the gallows he had intended for Mordecai became the means of his own execution. When the king learned of Mordecai's relation to Esther, he elevated him to Haman's rank and gave Esther Haman's house. The king also revoked the proclamation written by Haman to kill all the Jews. Then, according to Esther chapter 8, the Jews had light and gladness and joy and honor, and in every province and in every city, wherever the king's command and his edict reached, there was gladness and joy among the Jews, a feast and a holiday. Mordecai then exacted justice on the 10 sons of Haman and the enemies who had attempted to kill them. The irony of the book of Esther is that it never mentions God's name. Yet it is clear that God is supernaturally orchestrating the events in Esther's life. She was clearly prepared for such a time as this to save her people, according to Esther chapter 4. Mordecai, now second in rank to the king, decreed that the 14th and 15th days of the month of Adar be commemorated as a feast to remember the victory over their enemies. This year, Purim begins at sundown on March 13th. Jewish traditions for the holiday include the reading of the book of Esther, or in Hebrew, the Megillah, feasting, eating 3-cornered pastries, drinking wine, gifts of food to one another, and charitable donations to the poor. Thank you for listening. I'm Bill Petro, your friendly neighborhood historian. You can find more details on this topic and others on my website at billpetro.com.